Sarah Martinez had always been underestimated. At 28 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with gentle brown eyes and a soft voice that barely rose above a whisper during most conversations. When she walked through the halls of St. Mary's General Hospital in her scrubs, carrying her stethoscope, and wearing her hair in a simple ponytail, most people saw exactly what they expected to see: just another nurse doing her job. The emergency room where Sarah worked was nothing like the dramatic television shows that made nursing look glamorous. It was a place of constant chaos, where the smell of disinfectant mixed with human suffering, where screams and tears were as common as the beeping of monitors. Sarah had been working there for 6 years, ever since she graduated from nursing school, and she had seen everything the city could throw at them. Her colleagues knew her as the quiet one who never complained about double shifts, who always volunteered to work holidays so others could be with their families, and who had a gentle way with even the most difficult patients. Dr. Reynolds, the head of emergency medicine, often said that Sarah was the kind of nurse who could calm a storm with just her presence. But what none of them knew was that Sarah carried secrets from her past that had shaped her in ways they could never imagine. Growing up in a rough neighborhood on the east side of the city, Sarah had learned early that appearances could be deceiving. Her father, Miguel Martinez, had been a police officer for 25 years before retiring, and he had made sure his daughter knew how to protect herself. From the age of 12, Sarah had spent weekends at the shooting range with her father, learning not just how to handle firearms, but how to stay calm under pressure and make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. Her mother, Elena, had died when Sarah was 16, a victim of a random shooting during a convenience store robbery. The tragedy had driven Sarah toward nursing, determined to save lives rather than take them. But it had also reinforced the lessons her father had taught her about being prepared for the worst. She carried a concealed weapon permit and kept a small pistol locked in her car, though she prayed she would never need to use it. The night that would change everything started like any other Tuesday evening shift. Sarah arrived at the hospital at 6 in the evening, greeting the day shift nurses with her usual quiet smile, and accepting the handover of patients with her characteristic attention to detail. The emergency room was moderately busy, with the usual mix of heart attacks, car accident victims, and people seeking treatment for chronic conditions that had suddenly worsened. Dr. Rachel Kim was the attending physician that night, a brilliant woman in her early 40s who had worked alongside Sarah for 3 years. They had developed an easy partnership, with Dr. Kim trusting Sarah's instincts about patients, and Sarah providing the kind of steady, competent support that allowed the doctor to focus on the most critical cases. Around 8:30, the ambulance radio crackled to life with news of multiple gunshot victims coming in from a gang-related shooting downtown. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she helped prepare trauma rooms, knowing that nights like these tested everyone's limits. The first ambulance arrived within minutes, carrying a 17-year-old boy who had been shot in the chest. As Sarah helped wheel him into Trauma Room 1, she noticed the fear in his eyes and spoke to him in the same gentle voice she used with all her patients. "You're going to be okay," she told him, squeezing his hand briefly before stepping back to let Dr. Kim work. "We're going to take good care of you." The second ambulance brought in 2 more victims, a young woman who had been hit in the leg and an older man who had taken a bullet to the shoulder. Sarah moved between the rooms with practiced efficiency, starting 4 lines, monitoring vital signs, and providing the kind of seamless support that allowed the medical team to save lives. It was just after 10 o'clock when the 4th ambulance arrived, but this one was different. Instead of gunshot victims, it carried 2 paramedics who had been attacked while responding to what they thought was another victim from the shooting. One of them, a veteran named Tom Bradley whom Sarah had known for years, was unconscious with a severe head injury. The other, a young woman named Lisa Chun, was conscious but badly beaten and clearly traumatized. As they worked to stabilize Tom, Lisa grabbed Dr. Kim's arm with shaking hands. "They're still out there," she whispered. "The guys who did this. They said they were coming here next. They said hospitals are too soft, too easy." Dr. Kim and Sarah exchanged glances, but there was no time to process the warning fully. Tom needed immediate surgery, and they had other patients who required constant monitoring. Sarah helped transfer Tom to the surgical floor, then returned to the emergency room to continue her shift, though Lisa's words echoed in her mind. The hospital's security consisted of 2 guards, an older man named Frank who spent most of his time at the information desk in the main lobby, and a younger guard named Marcus who patrolled the halls but was largely untrained for serious threats. They had metal detectors at the main entrances and security cameras throughout the building, but, like most hospitals, St. Mary's was designed to be welcoming and accessible, not to repel determined attackers. Around 11:15, Sarah was checking on the teenage gunshot victim when she heard shouting from the waiting area. Through the small window in the trauma room door, she could see people running and screaming. Her training kicked in immediately, and she calmly but quickly moved her patient behind the heavy equipment in the room, then cracked the door to listen. 3 men had entered through the emergency room entrance, easily bypassing the single security guard by threatening him with weapons. They were demanding drugs, money, and, according to witnesses, looking for the snitches who had been brought in from the shooting earlier. Sarah realized with growing horror that they had come to finish what they had started on the street. Dr. Kim appeared beside her, having heard the commotion from the next room. "We need to call the police," she whispered, but, even as she said it, they could hear one of the intruders shouting that anyone who tried to use a phone would be shot. The 2 women crouched by the door, listening as the men moved through the emergency room. They could hear patients crying and staff members pleading. Sarah's mind raced through the layout of the department, thinking about where her colleagues were and how many innocent people were trapped in the waiting area. "Where are the doctors?" they heard one of the gunmen shout. "Where are the nurses who worked on our boys?" Sarah felt her blood run cold. These weren't random thieves looking for drugs. They had come specifically to target the medical staff who had tried to save the lives of their victims. She thought about Lisa's warning and realized that the attack on the paramedics had been reconnaissance, a way to learn about the hospital's schedule and security. Dr. Kim was fumbling with her phone, trying to text for help, when they heard footsteps approaching their trauma room. Sarah made a split-second decision that drew on all the training her father had given her years earlier. She had 2 choices: hide and hope for the best, or take action to protect the people under her care. "Stay with him," she whispered to Dr. Kim, nodding toward their patient. "No matter what happens, keep working on him." Before Dr. Kim could ask what she meant, Sarah slipped out of the trauma room and into the hallway. She could see one of the gunmen about 50 feet away, a tall man in dark clothing who was systematically checking each room. In his hand was a large pistol, and, from his movements, Sarah could tell he was experienced with weapons. She moved quietly toward the nurse's station, where she knew there was an emergency phone that connected directly to the police station. But, as she rounded the corner, she came face to face with a second gunman, this one younger and clearly more nervous than his partner. "Hey," he shouted, raising his weapon. "Get over here, nurse lady. You're exactly who we're looking for." Sarah raised her hand slowly, her mind calculating distances and angles. She could see the safety on his gun was off, and his finger was on the trigger. Behind him, she could hear his partner still searching rooms, and, beyond that, the sounds of terrified patients and staff. "Please," she said in the same gentle voice she used with frightened patients. "There are sick people here. Whatever you want, we can work this out without hurting anyone else." The young man laughed harshly. "You people think you're so smart, playing doctor, acting like heroes. You fixed up the wrong people tonight, lady. Now you're going to pay for it." As he spoke, Sarah noticed something that gave her hope. His hands were shaking, and he kept glancing nervously toward where his partner was searching. He was scared, which made him dangerous, but also potentially careless. "What's your name?" Sarah asked, taking a small step closer. "Shut up," he snapped. "I don't want to talk to you. I want you to get all your doctor friends and line up so we can finish this." But Sarah had dealt with frightened, angry people many times in the emergency room. She knew that sometimes the best way to defuse a situation was to treat the aggressor like what they often were: scared, hurt people who had made terrible choices. "I can see you're upset," she said calmly. "Someone you care about got hurt tonight. But killing nurses and doctors won't bring them back. It will just create more pain for more families." For a moment, something flickered in the young man's eyes, and Sarah thought she might be getting through to him. But then, they heard his partner calling from down the hall. "Marcus, did you find them? We need to move." The moment of connection was broken, and Marcus's face hardened again. "Move," he shouted at Sarah, gesturing with his gun toward the main part of the emergency room. "Get out there now." Sarah knew that once she was in the open area with the other hostages, her options would be severely limited. She also knew that with each passing minute, more people could be hurt or killed. As they walked toward the main emergency room, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew her as the quiet, gentle nurse who never raised her voice. When Marcus momentarily turned his head to call out to his partner again, Sarah struck with the speed and precision her father had drilled into her during countless hours of training. She grabbed his gun hand with both of hers, twisted it away from her body, and used his own momentum to send him stumbling into the wall. The weapon clattered to the floor, and both Sarah and Marcus dove for it. But Sarah's years of martial arts training, another skill her father had insisted she learn, gave her the advantage. She reached the gun first, rolled away from Marcus's grasping hands, and came up in a shooting stance that would have made her father proud. "Stay down," she commanded, and for the first time that night, her voice carried the authority of someone who would not be ignored. Marcus looked up at her with shock and rage. "You're just a nurse," he spat. "You don't know what you're doing." Sarah kept the gun trained on him while her mind raced through her next moves. She could hear his partner still searching rooms, apparently unaware of what had just happened. She had maybe 30 seconds before he realized something was wrong, and came looking for Marcus. "You're right," Sarah said quietly. "I am just a nurse. But I'm also a daughter who learned from a police officer father that sometimes you have to fight to protect innocent people. And right now, you're threatening my patients." The transformation in Sarah's demeanor was complete. The gentle, soft-spoken caregiver had been replaced by someone Marcus didn't recognize, someone whose steady hands and calm voice suggested she knew exactly what she was doing with the weapon she now held. From down the hall, they heard the other gunman calling out again, "Marcus, what's taking so long? We need to get out of here." Sarah made another split-second decision. Instead of waiting for the situation to escalate further, she was going to end it on her terms. With Marcus on the floor and his weapon now in her hands, Sarah found herself facing a situation she had trained for but hoped never to encounter. The familiar weight of the gun felt both foreign and natural in her grip, muscle memory from countless hours at the shooting range with her father competing with the nurturing instincts that had defined her career as a healer. She could hear the second gunman moving through the rooms more urgently now, his voice growing louder as he called for his partner. Sarah estimated she had less than a minute before he would come looking for Marcus and discover what had happened. The emergency room fell into an eerie quiet, broken only by the soft sobbing of patients and staff who were hiding wherever they could find shelter. "Listen to me very carefully," Sarah whispered to Marcus, who was sitting against the wall with his hands raised, his face a mixture of shock and fury. "You're going to call out to your friend and tell him everything is fine. You're going to tell him you found what you were looking for and you're ready to leave. If you try to warn him or signal that anything is wrong, I will stop you. Do you understand?" Marcus stared at her with disbelief. "Lady, you have no idea what you're dealing with. When Tony gets here, you're dead. He's not going to hesitate like I did." Sarah's expression didn't change, but, inside, she was processing every piece of information she could gather. The second gunman's name was Tony, and, according to Marcus, he was more dangerous and experienced than his younger partner. She also noted that Marcus had admitted to hesitating, which confirmed her assessment that he was the weaker link in their partnership. "Marcus," the voice from down the hall was getting closer, and Sarah could hear footsteps moving in their direction. "Where are you, man? We need to go." Sarah positioned herself behind a medical cart that would give her cover while still allowing her a clear line of sight to the hallway. She gestured for Marcus to respond, keeping the gun trained on him while staying hidden from view. "I'm here, Tony," Marcus called out, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm in the nurses' station area. I found some of them hiding." Sarah listened to the footsteps approach, mentally mapping Tony's location based on the sound. She had positioned herself so that when he came around the corner looking for Marcus, she would have a tactical advantage. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "In a dangerous situation, position is everything. Control the space, and you control the outcome." "Good." Tony's voice was much closer now. "Did you secure them? We need to finish this and get out before the cops show up." Sarah made a hand signal to Marcus, indicating that he should keep talking to draw Tony closer. For a moment, she thought he might refuse, but the young man seemed to realize that cooperating was his best chance of survival. "Yeah, I got them cornered," Marcus said, his voice growing steadier. "Come around the corner, and we can wrap this up." Sarah heard Tony's footsteps quicken, and she knew he was almost at the point where he would be able to see his partner sitting on the floor with his hands up. She had one chance to end this without anyone getting hurt, and it depended on timing and precision that would have to be perfect. When Tony rounded the corner, weapon raised, and ready to fire at whatever targets Marcus had supposedly cornered, he found himself face to face with a small woman in scrubs who was pointing a gun directly at his chest with the steady hands of someone who knew how to use it. "Drop your weapon," Sarah said in a voice that carried absolute authority. "Place it on the ground and step away from it." Now, for a split second, Tony froze, his brain trying to process what he was seeing. The surprise on his face quickly turned to calculation as he assessed the situation. Unlike his younger partner, Tony had been in armed confrontations before, and Sarah could see him evaluating his options. "You're making a mistake, nurse," Tony said, but he didn't lower his weapon. "You might have gotten the jump on my boy here, but you're out of your league. Put the gun down, and maybe we'll let you walk away from this." Sarah had been expecting this response. Her father had taught her that experienced criminals would almost always try to talk their way out of a situation before resorting to violence, testing their opponent's resolve and looking for signs of weakness or uncertainty. "The only mistake," Sarah replied calmly, "was you thinking that healthcare workers are easy targets. You have 3 seconds to drop your weapon before I drop you." In the silence that followed, Sarah could hear her own heartbeat and the soft sounds of people breathing in the rooms around them. She was acutely aware of every detail: the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of antiseptic mixed with fear-induced sweat, the weight of the gun in her hands, and the calculations running through Tony's eyes as he decided whether to call her bluff. What Tony couldn't know was that Sarah wasn't bluffing. She had made her decision the moment she decided to act instead of hide. She would not allow these men to hurt the patients and colleagues who depended on her. The gentle nurse who read bedtime stories to pediatric patients was still there, but she had been joined by the warrior her father had trained her to become when innocent lives were at stake. 1, Sarah counted aloud. Tony's grip shifted slightly on his weapon, and Sarah could see him preparing to make a move. Her finger moved to the trigger, and she adjusted her stance imperceptibly, ready to fire if necessary. 2. Okay, Marcus shouted from the floor. "Tony, just do what she says. This lady is crazy. She's not like the other nurses." But Tony had already made his decision. Instead of surrendering, he began to swing his weapon towards Sarah, gambling that she wouldn't actually pull the trigger. He had underestimated his opponent in the most fundamental way possible. Sarah's shot was precise and controlled, aimed not to kill but to disable. The bullet struck Tony's shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying across the floor. He dropped to his knees, clutching his wounded arm and staring at Sarah with shock and pain. "I told you I was just a nurse," Sarah said, moving quickly to kick his gun further away while keeping her weapon trained on both men. "What I didn't mention is that my father was a police officer who made sure his daughter could protect herself and others when necessary." The sound of the gunshot had echoed through the emergency room, and Sarah could hear people calling out in panic, uncertain whether the danger had increased or decreased. She needed to restore order quickly and get medical attention for Tony's wound, despite what he had done. "Dr. Kim," she called out loudly. "It's Sarah. The immediate threat is contained. I need you to come out and treat a gunshot wound." Within moments, Dr. Kim appeared from the trauma room where she had been hiding with their patient. Her face showed amazement and concern as she took in the scene. Marcus sitting against the wall with his hands up, Tony on the floor bleeding from his shoulder, and Sarah standing over both of them with a gun in her hands. "Sarah, what?" Dr. Kim began, but Sarah cut her off. "Questions later," Sarah said efficiently. "Right now, we have patients to care for. Tony needs immediate attention for his shoulder wound. Marcus is uninjured but needs to be secured until police arrive. Can you handle Tony's medical needs while I watch Marcus?" "Dr. Kim nodded, her medical training overriding her shock at seeing her quiet colleague transformed into someone she barely recognized. She knelt beside Tony and began assessing his wound, while Sarah maintained control of the situation. Over the next few minutes, the emergency room slowly returned to a controlled chaos that was much more familiar than what they had just experienced. Other staff members emerged from their hiding places, patients were reassured and treated, and Sarah coordinated with hospital security to secure the area until police could arrive. Frank, the older security guard, appeared looking shaken but grateful. "Sarah, I don't know how you did what you did, but you saved a lot of lives tonight." Sarah was beginning to feel the adrenaline wearing off, and with it came the emotional weight of what had just occurred. She had shot another human being, something she had trained for but hoped never to do. Even though it had been necessary to protect innocent people, the reality of her actions was beginning to settle in. "Is everyone accounted for?" she asked Frank, focusing on practical matters to keep her emotions in check. "Are there any other injuries among staff or patients?" "Everyone's okay," Frank confirmed. "Scared, but okay. The police should be here any minute." As if summoned by his words, the sound of sirens became audible in the distance, growing rapidly louder. Sarah carefully placed Tony's weapon on the nurse's station counter, away from both gunmen, but visible to the arriving officers. She kept Marcus's gun in her hand, but pointed at the floor, knowing that police arriving at a chaotic scene would need to immediately assess who represented a threat. Dr. Kim had stabilized Tony's shoulder wound and was preparing to take him into surgery. "The bullet went clean through," she told Sarah. "He'll recover fully, assuming he gets proper treatment." Sarah nodded, feeling a complex mixture of relief and regret. She had done what was necessary, but she took no satisfaction in causing harm, even to someone who had threatened innocent people. The first police officers through the door were responding to reports of shots fired at the hospital. They came in with weapons drawn, shouting commands, and trying to establish control of what they assumed was still an active threat situation. "Police! Everyone on the ground," the lead officer shouted. Sarah immediately placed Marcus's gun on the floor and stepped away from it with her hands visible. "Officers, I'm Sarah Martinez, a nurse here. I disarmed these two men when they threatened patients and staff. One suspect is wounded and receiving medical treatment. The other is uninjured but secured." The lead officer, a veteran named Sergeant Williams whom Sarah recognized from previous emergency room visits, looked around the scene with experienced eyes. He could see that the situation was under control, but he needed to process what had happened and ensure there were no additional threats. "Sarah, you said you disarmed them?" Sergeant Williams asked, holstering his weapon but remaining alert. "How exactly did that happen?" Before Sarah could answer, Marcus spoke up from his position against the wall. "She shot Tony. I swear, we didn't think any of these medical people knew how to fight back." Sergeant Williams looked at Sarah with new interest. He had known her peripherally through various emergency room interactions over the years, and she had always struck him as competent but quiet. The idea that she had successfully engaged and neutralized two armed suspects seemed almost impossible. "Sarah, I need to understand what happened here," he said. "Can you walk me through the sequence of events?" Sarah took a deep breath and began to recount the evening's events, starting with the arrival of the gunshot victims and Lisa's warning about the attackers. As she spoke, more police officers arrived, followed by paramedics and hospital administrators who had heard about the incident. Her account was clear, precise, and professional, delivered in the same calm voice she used to give patient reports to incoming shift nurses. She explained how she had identified the threat, made the decision to act rather than hide, disarmed Marcus, and ultimately shot Tony to prevent him from harming others. "Where did you learn to handle firearms?" Sergeant Williams asked when she had finished her account. "My father was a police officer," Sarah replied. "Miguel Martinez, retired from the department about 8 years ago. He made sure I knew how to protect myself and others if necessary." Sergeant Williams nodded with recognition. "I know Miguel. Good officer, good man. He trained you well." As the immediate crisis passed and the investigation began in earnest, Sarah found herself the center of attention in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. Hospital administrators wanted to speak with her, police detectives needed detailed statements, and News crews that had heard about the shooting were already gathering outside the hospital. But what mattered most to Sarah was that her patients were safe, her colleagues were unharmed, and the two men who had threatened innocent people were in custody. She had done what her father had taught her to do, protected those who couldn't protect themselves, using the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. As she finally sat down at the nurse's station to begin filling out the extensive paperwork that would be required, Dr. Kim approached her with 2 cups of coffee. "I've worked with you for 3 years, Dr. Kim said, sitting beside her colleague. "I thought I knew who you were, but tonight I saw someone I'd never met before." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully and considered the observation. "I'm the same person I've always been. I just had to use skills I hoped I'd never need." "Those men called you just a nurse, like it was something small," Dr. Kim continued. "But you showed them what just a nurse really means. Someone who protects life, no matter what it takes." Sarah sipped her coffee and looked around the emergency room, where the normal rhythm of medical care was slowly resuming. Patients were being treated, families were being comforted, and life-saving work was continuing despite the trauma of the evening. She thought about the young gunshot victim they had been treating when the attack began, and she was relieved to learn that he was stable and expected to recover. She thought about Tom Bradley, the paramedic who had been injured, and was grateful to hear that his surgery had been successful. She thought about all the patients and staff who had been terrorized but were now safe. Most of all, she thought about her father and the lessons he had taught her about courage, preparation, and the responsibility that came with the ability to protect others. Miguel Martinez had retired from active duty years ago, but tonight his training had saved lives through the actions of his daughter. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she had become a nurse to heal people, not to harm them. Yet tonight she had been forced to use violence to prevent greater violence. It was a contradiction she would have to process and understand in the days and weeks ahead. But as she sat in the emergency room where she had worked for 6 years, surrounded by colleagues who looked at her with new respect and gratitude, Sarah knew that she had acted according to her deepest values. She had protected the vulnerable, defended the innocent, and ensured that healers could continue their work of saving lives. The quiet nurse who never raised her voice had spoken loudly when it mattered most, and her message had been clear. Some things are worth fighting for, and some people will fight when fighting is necessary. The next few hours passed in a blur of interviews, statements, and medical procedures. Sarah found herself at the center of an investigation that would determine whether her actions constituted justifiable self-defense and defense of others, or whether charges might be filed against her for shooting Tony. While she logically knew that she had acted appropriately, the reality of the legal process was stressful and exhausting. Detective Maria Santos, a seasoned investigator with the Violent Crimes Unit, conducted the primary interview with Sarah. Detective Santos had worked dozens of cases involving hospital security incidents, but she had never encountered a situation where a nurse had successfully defended against armed attackers using their own weapons against them. "Walk me through your decision-making process," Detective Santos asked as they sat in a quiet conference room away from the chaos of the emergency room. "When you first encountered Marcus, what was going through your mind?" Sarah took a sip of her coffee and collected her thoughts. She had been answering questions for nearly 2 hours, but she understood the importance of being thorough and accurate in her responses. "My primary concern was the safety of my patients and colleagues," she said. "When Marcus pointed his weapon at me and demanded that I gather the medical staff, I knew that complying would likely result in multiple casualties. I had to make a choice between hoping someone else would handle the situation and taking action myself." "Had you ever been in a situation like this before?" the detective asked. "Never," Sarah replied. "But my father spent 25 years as a police officer, and he made sure I was prepared for dangerous situations. He always said that hoping for the best while preparing for the worst was the key to survival and to protecting others." Detective Santos made notes as Sarah spoke, occasionally asking for clarification about timing or specific details. The detective's questions were thorough but not hostile, and Sarah got the impression that Detective Santos understood the complex nature of the situation. "Tell me about the moment you decided to shoot Tony," Detective Santos said. "What convinced you that using deadly force was necessary?" Sarah paused, reliving those crucial seconds in her mind. Tony was an experienced criminal with no intention of surrendering. When I gave him the opportunity to drop his weapon, he chose instead to try to shoot me. At that point, I had to choose between allowing him to potentially kill me and then harm my patients and colleagues, or stopping him with the minimum force necessary. Why did you aim for his shoulder instead of center mass? The detective asked. Most people in your situation would have aimed to kill. Because I'm a nurse, Sarah replied simply. My job is to preserve life whenever possible. I used exactly the amount of force needed to neutralize the threat without causing unnecessary harm. Tony will recover fully from his wound. Detective Santos nodded and made a final note before closing her notebook. Sarah, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never interviewed someone who handled a situation like this with more professionalism and restraint. Your actions undoubtedly saved lives tonight. While the formal investigation continued, word of the incident had spread beyond the hospital. Sarah's father, Miguel, arrived at the hospital within an hour of being notified by police. He found his daughter sitting in the break room, still wearing her scrubs and looking exhausted but unharmed. Mija, he said, using the Spanish term of endearment he had called her since childhood. Are you okay? Sarah stood up and hugged her father tightly, finally, allowing herself to show the emotion she had been keeping in check since the shooting. I did what you taught me, Papa. I protected people who needed protecting. Miguel Martinez held his daughter for a long moment, feeling a complex mixture of pride and concern. He had hoped that the skills he had taught her would never be needed, but he was grateful that she had been prepared when the moment came. Tell me what happened, he said, and Sarah recounted the evening's events once again, this time adding details about her thoughts and feelings that she hadn't shared with the police. When I saw that gun pointed at Dr. Kim and our patients, something just clicked, she explained. All those hours at the shooting range, all those conversations about when it's necessary to act, all that training about staying calm under pressure, it all came together. Miguel listened carefully, occasionally nodding as he recognized elements of the training he had given her over the years. You made the right choices, he told her when she had finished. You assessed the threat accurately, you used appropriate force, and you minimized harm while protecting innocent people. I'm proud of you. As news of the incident spread through the hospital and into the community, Sarah began to understand that her life was going to change in ways she had never anticipated. Hospital administrators praised her heroism and announced that she would receive a commendation for her actions. Her colleagues looked at her with a mixture of awe and respect that made her uncomfortable. Dr. Reynolds, the head of emergency medicine, called Sarah into his office the following morning. She had gone home for a few hours of sleep, but returned to work despite being offered time off to process the trauma of the shooting. Sarah, I've been practicing emergency medicine for 20 years, Dr. Reynolds said, and I've never had a staff member show the kind of courage and competence you displayed last night. You literally saved lives. I just did what anyone would do in that situation, Sarah replied, uncomfortable with the praise. No, Dr. Reynolds said firmly. You did what someone with exceptional training, judgment, and courage would do. Most people would have hidden and hoped for the best. You took action and neutralized the threat. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. A hospital administrator entered, followed by a woman Sarah didn't recognize carrying a notebook and camera equipment. Sarah, this is Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News, the administrator said. She'd like to interview you about last night's incident. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had agreed to speak with police and hospital administration, but she had no desire to become a public figure or to have her private life scrutinized by the media. I appreciate the interest, she told the reporter, but I'd prefer not to do any interviews. What happened last night was a medical emergency that required an unusual response. I'd rather let my actions speak for themselves. Jennifer Walsh was persistent, explaining the public interest in the story and the positive impact that Sarah's example could have on discussions about hospital security and self-defense. But Sarah remained polite but firm in her refusal to participate in media coverage. After the reporter left, Dr. Reynolds looked at Sarah with understanding. You're going to get a lot of attention over this, whether you want it or not. Have you thought about how you want to handle it? Sarah had been thinking about little else since the shooting. She understood that her actions had implications beyond her own life and career. The incident would likely influence hospital security policies, staff training programs, and public discussions about the rights and responsibilities of healthcare workers. "I want to get back to being a nurse," she said. "I want to take care of patients and work with my colleagues and do the job I love. What happened last night was extraordinary, but I don't want it to define my entire career." Dr. Reynolds nodded. "I understand, and we'll do everything we can to support you in that goal. But you should know that your actions have already started conversations about healthcare workers' safety that needed to happen." Over the next few days, Sarah learned that the incident had indeed sparked broader discussions about hospital security. The fact that a nurse had been forced to use deadly force to protect patients and colleagues highlighted vulnerabilities in healthcare settings that many people had never considered. Tom Bradley, the paramedic who had been beaten during the initial attack, was released from the hospital after a successful surgery. He made a point of thanking Sarah personally for stopping the men who had hurt him and who had planned to hurt others. "You did something incredible," he told her. "You turned a terrible situation around and saved lives. I hope you know how grateful we all are." Lisa Chun, the other paramedic who had been attacked, also visited Sarah before being discharged. She had been the one to warn the hospital staff about the impending threat, though she had been too traumatized at the time to provide specific details. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been there," Lisa said. "Those men were talking about killing medical personnel. They said doctors and nurses thought they were better than everyone else and needed to be taught a lesson." Sarah listened to these accounts with growing understanding of how close the situation had come to becoming a massacre. The two gunmen had been motivated not just by the desire to silence potential witnesses to their earlier crimes, but by a resentment toward healthcare workers who had treated their victims. Marcus and Tony, meanwhile, were recovering from their injuries under police guard. Marcus had suffered only minor bruises from his encounter with Sarah, while Tony's shoulder wound was healing well. Both men were facing multiple felony charges including armed robbery, assault, and attempted murder. During questioning, they revealed that they had planned the hospital attack for several hours after their initial shooting spree downtown. They had specifically chosen St. Mary's because they believed it would be an easy target with minimal security and staff who wouldn't fight back. "We figured nurses and doctors would just do whatever we told them," Marcus told investigators. "We didn't know any of them could fight." Sarah was disturbed by this revelation, not because of the threat to herself, but because it highlighted a dangerous assumption that healthcare workers were soft targets. She began to think about whether there were ways to improve security and staff training without compromising the welcoming, healing environment that hospitals needed to maintain. A week after the shooting, Sarah received a call from her father asking her to meet him for lunch. When she arrived at the small Mexican restaurant where they had shared countless meals over the years, she found Miguel waiting with someone she didn't recognize. "Mija, I want you to meet Captain Jennifer Rodriguez from the police academy," Miguel said. "She has a proposition for you." Captain Rodriguez was a woman in her early 50s with an air of authority and competence that reminded Sarah of her father. She explained that the police department was developing new training programs for civilian first responders, including healthcare workers, and they wanted Sarah to help design and implement the curriculum. "What you did at the hospital demonstrated skills that we think other medical personnel should have," Captain Rodriguez explained. "Not necessarily weapons training, though that could be part of it, but situational awareness, threat assessment, and crisis management under pressure." Sarah was intrigued by the proposal, but also concerned about the time commitment and whether it would interfere with her nursing duties. "I appreciate the offer, but my primary responsibility is to my patients and my colleagues at the hospital." "We understand that," Captain Rodriguez assured her. "This would be a part-time consulting role that would work around your nursing schedule, and the skills we'd be teaching could ultimately make hospitals safer for everyone." As Sarah considered the offer, she realized that the shooting had given her an opportunity to influence positive change in healthcare security. She could use her experience to help other medical professionals be better prepared for emergency situations, potentially preventing future tragedies. "I'll think about it," she told Captain Rodriguez. "But any involvement I have would need to be focused on making hospitals safer for patients and staff, not on turning healthcare workers into security guards." Absolutely, Captain Rodriguez agreed. The goal is education and preparedness, not militarization of medical settings. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment, looking at the stack of thank you cards and letters that had been arriving since news of the shooting became public. Patients she had cared for over the years, colleagues from other hospitals, and complete strangers had written to express their gratitude and admiration for her actions. One letter, from a retired nurse named Dorothy Peterson, particularly moved Sarah. Dear Sarah, I worked in emergency medicine for 40 years before retiring last year. I have been in situations where I felt helpless to protect my patients from violence and chaos. What you did took incredible courage and skill, but more importantly, it demonstrated the very best of what it means to be a nurse. You protected those who were vulnerable, you acted with compassion even toward those who threatened you, and you never forgot that your primary mission was to preserve life. Thank you for showing the world what nurses are capable of when we need to be. Sarah put down the letter and reflected on the week that had transformed her life. She was still the same person who loved caring for patients, who found satisfaction in healing and comforting others, and who had chosen nursing as a career because she wanted to make a positive difference in people's lives. But she was also someone who had been tested under extreme circumstances and had proven capable of protecting others when protection was needed. She had discovered that being a healer and being a warrior weren't contradictory roles. Sometimes, they were complementary aspects of the same mission. As she prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision about Captain Rodriguez's offer. She would accept the consulting role, but with the understanding that her goal would be to help healthcare workers never need to use the skills she had been forced to employ. The best outcome would be improved security and awareness that prevented violent incidents rather than simply preparing people to respond to them. She also decided that she would continue working as a floor nurse at St. Mary's, continuing to provide direct patient care while also contributing to broader improvements in healthcare safety. The quiet nurse who had never raised her voice would continue to speak through her actions, working to create a world where healers could focus on healing. 3 months after the shooting, Sarah's life had settled into a new rhythm that balanced her nursing duties with her growing role as a consultant for healthcare security training. The initial media attention had died down, much to her relief, but the impact of that night continued to spread in ways she had never anticipated. St. Mary's Hospital had implemented new security protocols based partly on lessons learned from the incident. The changes were subtle but meaningful: improved communication systems between security and medical staff, enhanced training for recognizing potential threats, and better coordination with local law enforcement. The hospital had also hired additional security personnel and upgraded their surveillance systems. Sarah's colleagues had gradually adjusted to seeing her in a new light. The transformation hadn't been easy for everyone to process. Some staff members admitted they had initially felt uncomfortable around her after learning about her actions, while others seemed to expect her to become a completely different person. But Sarah had worked hard to maintain the same gentle, caring demeanor that had always defined her nursing practice. Dr. Kim had become one of Sarah's strongest supporters and closest friends. The shared experience of that traumatic night had created a bond between them that went beyond their professional relationship. You know what I think about most when I remember that night? Dr. Kim said one evening as they finished their shift together. It's not the shooting or the chaos. It's the moment when you told me to keep working on our patient no matter what happened. You were facing armed attackers, but you were still thinking about patient care first. Sarah smiled at the observation. That's what we do, isn't it? We take care of people. Everything else is just obstacles we have to overcome to do our job. The training program Sarah had helped develop was now being implemented in hospitals throughout the state. The curriculum focused on situational awareness, de-escalation techniques, and emergency response protocols rather than weapons training. Sarah had insisted that the program emphasize the medical professional's primary mission of healing while providing practical skills for recognizing and responding to security threats. Captain Rodriguez had been impressed with Sarah's approach to the training development. You've managed to create something that enhances safety without changing the fundamental culture of healthcare, she told Sarah during one of their planning meetings. That's exactly what we hoped for but weren't sure was possible. The pilot program had been tested at 5 hospitals with remarkable results. Staff reported feeling more confident and prepared, while maintaining their focus on patient care. More importantly, several potential incidents had been identified and defused before they escalated to violence. One afternoon, Sarah received a phone call that would provide closure to one of the most difficult aspects of the shooting incident. Detective Santos called to inform her that Tony and Marcus had both pled guilty to multiple charges and would be sentenced to lengthy prison terms. "Tony wants to speak with you," Detective Santos said. "He's asked if you would be willing to visit him before his sentencing hearing." Sarah was surprised by the request. She had thought about both men frequently in the months since the shooting, wondering about their motivations and hoping they might find ways to change their lives while incarcerated. "What does he want to say?" Sarah asked. "I think he wants to apologize and thank you," Detective Santos replied. "His lawyer says the shooting was a wake-up call for him. He realizes how close he came to committing murder and how your restraint probably saved his life." Sarah agreed to the meeting, though she wasn't sure what to expect. 2 days later, she found herself in a visiting room at the county jail, sitting across from Tony, who looked very different from the dangerous criminal she had confronted in the hospital. His shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a small scar as evidence of their encounter. But the change in his demeanor was dramatic. He appeared younger and less hardened, and when he spoke, his voice carried genuine remorse. "I've been thinking about that night every day since it happened," Tony began. "I keep wondering what would have happened if you hadn't stopped us. How many people would be dead right now if you hadn't been there?" Sarah listened without interrupting, studying the man who had pointed a gun at her and her colleagues just a few months earlier. "I want you to know that I'm grateful you didn't kill me," Tony continued. "I deserved to die for what I was planning to do, but you gave me a chance to live and maybe make things right somehow. That's something I'll never forget." "What are your plans when you get out of prison?" Sarah asked. "I'll be in for at least 15 years, Tony replied. "I want to use that time to get my education, maybe learn a trade. My lawyer is helping me write letters to the families of people I hurt before that night at the hospital. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to try to make amends." Sarah found herself moved by Tony's apparent sincerity. She had wondered whether he would view his capture as a temporary setback or as an opportunity for genuine change. His words suggested the latter, though she knew that real transformation would take years to prove. "I hope you mean what you're saying," Sarah told him. "You have a long time to think about the kind of person you want to be when you get out. Use it well." As she left the jail, Sarah reflected on the strange turn of events that had led her to have a civil conversation with someone who had once threatened to kill her. The experience reinforced her belief that people were capable of change, even under the most difficult circumstances. The encounter with Tony also reminded Sarah of one of the most challenging aspects of the shooting's aftermath, dealing with her own emotions about using violence, even justified violence, against another person. She had been seeing a counselor who specialized in working with first responders and others who had experienced traumatic incidents. Dr. Margaret Chun, her counselor, had helped Sarah process the complex feelings that arose from being forced to use her weapons training in a real-world situation. The sessions had been particularly valuable in helping Sarah understand that feeling conflicted about the shooting was normal and healthy. "You were raised to be a healer, and you chose a profession dedicated to preserving life," Dr. Chun had explained during one session. "When circumstances forced you to use violence, even justified violence, it created a conflict with your fundamental values. Working through that conflict is important for your long-term emotional health." Sarah had learned to accept that she could feel proud of protecting innocent people while simultaneously regretting that violence had been necessary. The two emotions weren't contradictory. They were both natural responses to a complex situation. Her father, Miguel, had been instrumental in helping her navigate these emotional challenges. As a retired police officer, he understood the psychological impact of using deadly force, even in clearly justified circumstances. "The fact that you feel conflicted shows that you're the right kind of person to have these capabilities," he told her during one of their regular lunch meetings. "People who use violence easily and without remorse are dangerous. People like you, who understand the weight of what they're doing, are the ones we can trust with these responsibilities." 6 months after the shooting, Sarah was invited to speak at a national conference on healthcare security. The invitation came from the American Hospital Association, which wanted her to share her experience and insights with hospital administrators, and security professionals from across the country. Sarah was hesitant to accept the speaking engagement. She had consistently avoided media attention and public appearances, preferring to focus on her work rather than her personal story. But the conference organizers convinced her that her perspective could help improve safety at hospitals nationwide. The speech Sarah delivered was characteristic of her approach to the entire situation: practical, thoughtful, and focused on protecting others rather than glorifying her own actions. "I didn't set out to become a symbol or a spokesperson," she told the audience of several hundred healthcare professionals. "I became a nurse because I wanted to heal people and make their lives better. What happened at my hospital was an extraordinary situation that required an extraordinary response." She continued, "But the real lesson isn't about what I did that night. It's about what we all need to do every day to create environments where patients feel safe, staff feel supported, and healing can happen without the threat of violence." Sarah's speech focused on practical recommendations for improving hospital security without creating fortress-like environments that would inhibit the open, caring atmosphere essential to healthcare. She emphasized the importance of training, communication, and collaboration between medical staff and security professionals. The response to her presentation was overwhelmingly positive. Hospital administrators approached her afterward with questions about implementing similar training programs at their facilities. Security professionals wanted to know more about her techniques for situational awareness and threat assessment. More importantly to Sarah, several nurses and doctors thanked her for showing that healthcare workers could be both caring healers and effective protectors when circumstances required it. One conversation with a young nurse named Jennifer from a hospital in Chicago particularly moved Sarah. "I've been working in a trauma center for 2 years," Jennifer said, "and there have been several incidents where patients' family members or gang members have threatened staff. I always felt helpless in those situations, like there was nothing I could do except hope security would handle it. Your story shows me that I have more options than I thought." Sarah spent considerable time talking with Jennifer and other young healthcare workers, emphasizing that the goal wasn't to turn nurses into guards, but to help them recognize dangerous situations early and respond appropriately. "The best self-defense is avoiding dangerous situations in the first place," Sarah explained. "But when that's not possible, you need to know how to protect yourself and your patients. That might mean calling security, evacuating an area, or in extreme cases, fighting back. The key is being prepared and making good decisions under pressure." As Sarah's first year since the shooting drew to a close, she took stock of how her life had changed. She was still working as a nurse at St. Mary's, still caring for patients with the same dedication and gentleness that had always characterized her approach to medicine. But she had also become an advocate for healthcare worker safety and a trainer for emergency response situations. The consulting work with police departments and hospitals had grown into a significant part of her professional life, though she continued to limit it to ensure that patient care remained her primary focus. She had helped develop training programs that were now being used in dozens of hospitals across multiple states. Perhaps most significantly, Sarah had learned things about herself that she might never have discovered under ordinary circumstances. She had found that she was capable of remaining calm and effective under extreme pressure, that her father's training had prepared her for situations she had hoped never to encounter, and that being a healer and being a protector could be complementary rather than contradictory roles. The shooting had also strengthened her relationships with her colleagues and family. Dr. Kim had become a close friend and trusted confidant. Her father's pride in her actions had deepened their already strong bond. Even her relationship with her colleagues had evolved in positive ways, as many of them came to appreciate her combination of gentleness and strength. On the 1-year anniversary of the shooting, Sarah arrived at work to find a surprise waiting for her in the break room. Her colleagues had organized a small celebration, not of the violence that had occurred, but of the lives that had been saved and the positive changes that had resulted from the incident. "We wanted to mark this day," Dr. Reynolds explained, "not because of what those men tried to do to us, but because of what you did for us. You showed all of us what it means to truly protect and serve others." The gathering was small and subdued, reflecting the complex emotions surrounding the anniversary. Sarah was touched by her colleague's gesture, but remained focused on the future rather than the past. "I hope we never face a situation like that again," she said when asked to speak to the group. "But if we do, I hope we'll all be prepared to protect each other and our patients, whatever that requires." As Sarah looked around the room at her colleagues, she realized that the shooting had accomplished something the gunman had never intended. Instead of terrorizing the hospital staff and making them feel vulnerable, the incident had ultimately made them stronger, more united, and better prepared to face whatever challenges might come. The quiet nurse who had never raised her voice had spoken volumes about courage, preparedness, and the lengths to which healthcare workers would go to protect those in their care. Her story had rippled outward, inspiring changes in policies, training programs, and attitudes about healthcare worker safety across the country. Most importantly, Sarah had proven that being a healer didn't mean being helpless, that caring for others sometimes required being willing to fight for them, and that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the situation demanded it. She had shown that nurses were far from just anything. They were professionals capable of rising to any challenge in service of their fundamental mission, protecting and preserving human life.